Gosh, it's hard to believe that we're well over halfway through January. It's our month of new beginnings. I guess we can say that the new beginning is starting to get a little old by now. I'm sure we've all heard about how January is named after this Roman god named Janus. It's another one of those gods that nobody believes in anymore, but the stories, the mythology sticks with us. It becomes a part of our vocabulary. January, named after Janus, who's known as the two-faced god. This guy here. Now, you call somebody two-faced today, you're asking for trouble. It's regarded as an insult, but when it comes to Janus, it was a literal thing. He's depicted as having two faces, like this one here, or maybe the next one. This is a real coin from back in the day with another depiction of Janus. One face looks forward. One face looks back. One face looks at new beginnings, and the other face looks back at the past. All of the stuff that we have to let go of as we start a new year. Now, this presents a bit of a paradox because, you can't move forward if you're still clinging to the past, and yet we have to, or I think we ought to remember the past so that we can learn from our experiences, so we can carry that learning into the future. It'll be helpful if we want to be successful going forward to learn from the past and remember those things. And then we add to the paradoxical confusion by talking about the power of now. Forget about the past, stop looking to the future, and just live in the now moment. You remember that book, The Power of Now? It's been a few years back, over 10 years I think, that it was really popular. And I remember there are always people who take an idea to ridiculous extremes. I knew of one person who was so taken with the idea of living in the now, not going to pay attention to the future, not going to hang on to the past. They ended up in foreclosure and bankruptcy. Classic example of metaphysical malpractice. Self-inflicted. It's what happens when we take things too literally or superficially, or when we take a good idea to extremes. Being in the now moment is great if you're practicing meditation. It's a great discipline for the mind. But in the rest of our lives, most of the time, we need to be taking all three of those things into account. Past, present, and future. We become attached to one at the expense of the other two. That's a recipe for trouble. Back when Karen and I were studying at Unity Institute back in Kansas City, one of our instructors gave us an essay that compares life and living with being a trapeze artist. Now, if you've ever been to a good old-fashioned circus, or even, I guess, the Cirque du Soleil today, which is really popular, they almost always have a flying trapeze act. The performer grabs the bar and pushes off into the wild blue yonder, and at some point in the act, while they're swinging out, they have to pick the right moment to let go of the bar. As long as they're hanging on to that sucker, they're safe. But unless they let go of it, eventually they're going to swing back and forth, and they're just going to be hanging there in space with no place to go. So they pick the right moment to let go, and they do that by watching the other bar swinging in the air. They're sort of anticipating the future, right? They're predicting the future. They let go at the exact moment when they figure that other bar is going to be in the right position for them to grab it. And in between letting go and grabbing on again, they're flying. Hard to say that any one of those moments is more important than the others. What would happen if we were a trapeze artist and we thought, oh wow, I love this now moment sensation of flying. And we forget to look for the other bar swinging towards us, right? Not good, especially if you're working without a net. They're all important. Letting go, flying, and grabbing on again. But I think we would probably all agree that There's one that's a bit more difficult than the others, and I think that would be letting go. Letting go of the thing that's solid, familiar, and safe. Our Buddhist friends have a word that they use to describe the kind of mindset that can do that with a certain amount of ease. They call it non-attachment. In fact, the Buddhists are the masters of the spiritual process of non-attachment and letting go. It's a major part of their teaching. Now, that doesn't mean that our own Judeo-Christian heritage is devoid of teachings about non-attachment. Who remembers the story of Lot's wife? It's an interesting story. It comes to us from the book of Genesis. She doesn't have a name. She's just Lot's wife. And they lived in the infamous twin cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, which God wanted to destroy for different reasons that scholars are still arguing about today. But Lot and his wife didn't seem to have any problem living there. But they get this warning. They're told, head for the hills, don't look back because God's going to destroy the place. Change was afoot. Time to let go and move on. And as they were fleeing, as they were headed for the hills, what did Lot's wife do? But she turned around for one last look as the fire and brimstone were raining down, and she turns into a pillar of salt. Lots of strange stories in the Bible. and this is one of the stranger ones. But after all, God said, don't look back. And she did. Strange story. But we remember it, don't we? That's the power of mythology. That's the power of a story well told. They stay with us, like Aesop's fables. The moral in the story of Lot's wife is that when we're given an opportunity for a new beginning, don't keep looking back to the past, or you'll become crystallized, stuck, inflexible. You run the risk of missing an important opportunity. So we go from Genesis, first book in the Bible, we get into the Christian scriptures, and we find that Jesus, he's even more blunt when talking about non-attachment. Here's a passage from Luke. This is the advice that he gave to two potential disciples. To another he said, follow me. But he said, Lord, first let me go and bury my father. But Jesus said to him, let the dead bury their own dead. But as for you, go and proclaim the kingdom of God. Another said, I will follow you, Lord, but let me first say farewell to those at my home. Jesus said to him, no one who puts a hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God. Pretty blunt. How about this little gem? Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Wow. None of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all of your possessions. I've never been able to figure out how the family values Christian crowd manages to avoid talking about these passages. And they're the ones who insist that we ought to take everything literally. Man, you look at these things literally, that's pretty harsh. That's pretty harsh. And of course, you know how it works in unity. There isn't much that we do take literally. You know, Jesus was a wisdom teacher. And that's a long-standing tradition in all religions. Wisdom teachers like to say outrageous things to make a point. You remember it. You hear something like this and it sticks with you. You may not like it, but it sticks with you. Call it hyperbole. Call it over-exaggeration for the sake of driving home your point and making it stick. It works. The biggest problem we have with the Gospels is that Jesus never wrote anything down. Neither did his disciples. The earliest Gospel we have is Mark, and it wasn't recorded until around 35 years after the crucifixion. it was written in Greek. Jesus spoke Aramaic, which was a very rich and nuanced and symbolic language. So people had to remember what he said, speaking in Aramaic. Then you got to go and translate it into Greek. Things can get strange, especially when you're taking something literally that perhaps in Aramaic was never intended to be taken literally. Now, for those of you who might want to dig deeper into the question of how things can get lost in translation, here's a good place to start. It's a book I've talked about before, Misquoting Jesus, the story behind who changed the Bible and why. And that's just a reference for you. That's a separate topic for another day if you're interested. But the point that Jesus, the wisdom teacher, was trying to make is that sometimes we have to be willing to let go of even our most cherished and comforting ideas and traditions in order to advance down the spiritual path, in order to take that next step up in our evolution of consciousness. It's not so much about giving up the things we possess, it's about giving up the things that possess and control us. Now, when we think of it that way, well, it seems like that should be easy to do, right? You know, giving up the things that possess and control us, who wants that? It should be easy to do. And the problem is that we just don't see it. We just don't see all the ways that material things and spiritual things too can possess and control us. That's the light that Jesus is trying to shine on this whole subject matter by saying those things. And notice I said spiritual too. There is such a thing as spiritual materialism, where we use the intangible side of reality to avoid having to face the tangible side. Sometimes they call it spiritual bypassing. Whatever it is that we refuse to examine and question has the potential to possess and control us. There are people whose blood pressure and cortisol levels rise and fall with the stock market, right? Others who become withdrawn and depressed because they've failed to manifest health, money, or whatever it is that the latest pop fad new age self-help book promises that you should be able to manifest. I must be doing something wrong. What's wrong with me? Let it go. Even the so-called spiritual stuff. Forget about manifesting. What we really start to find out is that we're not really in control. At least we're in control of very little, a lot less than we think we are. Whether it's the stock market or the supermarket, we don't control the stuff that goes on out there. The best we can do is to control what we do with it. So when it comes to letting go, one of the best places to start is letting go of this idea that we need to control, that we are in control, that we should control. Whether we call it spiritual or material, as soon as we give in to the idea that we can control reality, guess who wins? The ego. The ego wins. That's what it comes down to. Control is what the ego wants. Manipulation, control, exploitation, power. It travels in many different disguises, but underneath it's always the ego at work. So we want to learn, again, how to question, how to probe, how to look beyond the disguise, beneath the surface, to question things, to take it deeper. Not because we want to control the ego. How ironic would that be? And yet, there are spiritual teachers who talk about this as if it's some form of warfare, like it's an adversarial process. We're going to expose the ego. We're going to hunt it down so that we can flush it out, control it, ultimately vanquish it. And when we do that, the ego just says, "Oh, excellent. You become just like me." It's not warfare. This is a gentle process. The essence of what we call true spirituality is this gentle and compassionate process of increasing our awareness, of looking, of taking more perspectives, of probing and questioning everything, including our closely held conclusions and assumptions. And the goal is to alleviate suffering. Suffering for ourselves and ultimately for others. And by suffering, I'm talking about the kind of stress and anxiety that comes from our clinging and attachment to the illusion of control and permanence. We treat things as being permanent that are by their nature impermanent, and when they go away and we become anxious and stressed out, it's a self-inflicted form of suffering. The Buddha gave us the Four Noble Truths. We talk about them quite a bit. And the first of the Four Noble Truths is usually translated as life is suffering. And this is something I learned recently. It's interesting. The Buddhists have the exact same problem that we have in the West when it comes to translating their scriptures. Turns out that this translation, life is suffering, isn't quite accurate. This is from Buddhist monk and scholar Thanissaro Bhikkhu. He says, this is where it's so important that the first noble truth not say that life is suffering. For if life were suffering, where would we look for an end to suffering? We'd be left with nothing but death and annihilation. But when the actual truth is that clinging is suffering, we simply have to look to see precisely where clinging is and learn not to cling. This is a great reinterpretation of life as suffering, because every time I talk about the Four Noble Truths, I get pushed back. Oh, life, you can't call life suffering. That's so negative and down and so on and so forth. And yet when we look at it this way, life is attachment. All right? Don't we go through life attached to things, and that's what causes the suffering. So no, life is not one long slog through suffering, but if we're clinging and attached, then life can involve a lot of suffering. And I think that's a great interpretation of this. So, learning not to cling, learning how to let go, practicing non-attachment. It's a minute-by-minute, day-by-day process. It's the work of a lifetime. So here we are in January, the time of new beginnings. How about trying it on for this year? All right. See how it goes. See you next week.